Ambassador Pedro Pedroso Cuesta, thank you very much for being with us today in Geneva in the context of this interdisciplinary conference on democracy and finance. My first question, because you are the chairman of the Group 77 plus China for 2023, representing Cuba. My first question is, how democratic are, at the moment, international financial institutions?
Well, thank you very much, Edoardo, for inviting me to this international conference on democracy and finance, which I find very useful. It's a discussion that very much welcome at the time is taking place. Just to respond directly to your question, I don't think that the international financial institutions are democratic at all. First of all, because what is known as the Bretton Woods institution, which was a product of the end of the Second World War, it's a reflection of the world of those times. It's a reflection of the international balances and the international order derived from the Second World War in 1945, where just a handful of countries intervene in the design of the Bretton Woods institutions. So most of the countries that today are the members of the United Nations, for example, were not part of that, of the creation of the international financial institution. So for that very first factor, nobody can legitimately argue that the Bretton Woods institution are democratic in essence, because they don't reflect the situation of the present time. They don't reflect the interests and needs of most of the countries that today are part of that system. But if I go to the other factor, which is the most fundamental factor, is the decision-making mechanism in the national financial institutions, which is not democratic at all. It's not one country, one vote, but the economic weight of the country, particularly the case of the United States, that is the one that has the most voting power in those organizations. So it's very clear. It's not a democratic. It's not a democratic system. It's a system that in a number of occasions, have acted against national interests of developing countries. It's a system that goes along the line of the interests of major transnational corporations and work for national interests. So for a number of reasons, it's not a democratic system. That's why today a very topical discussion in New York, when I'm coming from, is exactly the need to reform the international financial architecture.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This brings me to the second question that I had for you. What can be done to create more inclusive and more democratic financial institutions?
I mean, to put it bluntly, we need to have an overhaul of those institutions. We know it's an uphill task. One cannot be naive. It's reforming, a real reform of international financial architecture will take. It's an issue that the G77 itself has been demanding since 40 years back. And for the first time, a Secretary General of the United Nations has embraced that demand. So Secretary General Guterres has said in the high-level dialogue of the 77th session of the General Assembly last September, very vigorously, the need to reform those institutions. He has defined them as corrupt and bodies that need to be transformed deeply. So what can be done? The first thing that needs to be done is that the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, are open to discussion. that is the first step for that. They have to come. They have felt themselves until now of something different from the UN system. The UN system is the UN at the center and the rest of international organizations, a specialized organization by the charter who are part of the system. But the Bretton Woods institution, they have not considered themselves as part of that system, meaning that they are not under the umbrella of the UN. And the UN is there and we are here. We can be related, we can interact, but you don't govern us. We govern by ourselves. That needs to be changed. And the first thing is that the managers of those institutions need to be open to a frank and open discussion on this issue. Second, we will have to look at the decision-making mechanism, as I said before. There is no doubt that will have to be transformed. We will have to look in the way of reforming the IFI to the question of special drawing rights, for example. It's a clear need that we need a different system to distribute the special drawing rights, particularly to developing countries. And this has a very direct impact with a question of foreign debt, for example. There is a huge crisis of indebtedness in the South, particularly for the middle-income countries. The case of Latin America, the case of the Caribbean countries in Latin America, the case of middle-income countries in Latin America is very telling of what is going on and why I say there is a need to look for a new system of distribution of special drawing rights, and also for distributing those rights, those special drawing rights that developed countries don't use because they don't need them. So that there is a quite significant amount of resources that are there that could be used by countries who are suffering from a very high indebtedness rate, and they cannot use it. So we have to look at this, all these factors to start pushing a movement with that objective. And I'm not saying that would be done within 1 year or within 2 years, but we really need to start a process which would be very sensitive, will be very complex. It's not going to be an easy thing to do, but it's very much needed that we undertake it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. My final question is, what is currently doing the Group of 77 plus China to reform the international financial architecture? What are the plans for the future?
There is a very central discussion in New York right now, which is the question of financing for development, which is a cross-cutting issue to every single process that is taking place or that will take place in the near future. We are going to have, during the next high-level segment of the General Assembly, the 78th session of the General Assembly, a summit on the 2030 agenda and the SDG, which is the priority for the G77 and China. And in that context, we have started already the preparation and the discussions in New York on that event. And the issue of finance has come very prominently, because it's quite clear that we are behind track in reaching the SDGs, for example. And that was not because of the pandemic. The only thing the pandemic has caused is to deepen that crisis of implementation, but we were off track even before the pandemic in fulfilling the SDG. So the question of financing have come up very prominently, as I said, in those discussions, because we have everything. We have the narrative, we have the normative, we have the legislation. The only thing we don't have is the implementation. and implementation because of the lack of financing. There has been a clear decline in international development finance, both bilateral, official development assistance, ODA. Less developed countries today are dedicating the 0.7% of their GDP to development assistance and multilateral financing. So the same goes for when we discuss climate, for example. We have everything. Developing countries have committed to reduce emissions, even if they are not the most responsible for the climate change. And there is nothing. The $100 billion that were promised since the fraudulent conference in Copenhagen till 2020, they have not delivered the $100 billion. So there is a huge gap in financing. Whatever you take it, we had the Addis Ababa conference some years back, from which it was adopted the Addis Ababa Plan of Action on Financing. There is nothing since then. So there is a huge crisis in this sector. Nobody can say there is no money, that there is no financing, because by the other side, we have seen how the military industry has been growing, and every year there has been more investment in the military industry. And that is taking away very precious resources from something that is meaningful, something that is impactful, which is development, to something that is not taking us anywhere but to the destruction of the world. It's very key, the discussion of financing. And of course, when we discuss about financing, it takes us back again to the discussion on reform with international financial architecture, because part of these huge crises is suffered, for example, by the middle-income countries that I referred some moments ago. And these institutions are doing nothing for the middle-income countries. So these countries are penalized because they have made progress in their development. And at the same time, they suffer because of the debt. So what these institutions are doing to address that? Nothing in particular. What they are doing to address the situation of the most vulnerable countries to climate change? Nothing in particular. They have not given financing for adaptation in climate change. They have not given the very much needed financing for mitigation, because we only can mitigate with a change in our technological path. I mean, the change from the carbon intensity industry can only be done if we just leapfrog to renewable. And developing countries cannot do that without financing and without technology. And for none of those, there has been a penny.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being with us. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.